welcome to Business Talk Sister Gawk. I'm Becca, and today's podcast episode topic is What the FEMA is Going On, Part 2. And if you missed the first episode, you should go back and listen to it because it was a brief history of FEMA, as well as a little bit you need to know about the very beginning of what it means for a small business owner. The next question we were talking about covering in this episode is how do you even get declared a FEMA natural disaster area? Well, did you know there's actually a dollar amount threshold of damages that need to be met in order to qualify a region for FEMA response dollars? And the state can, at that point, ask the president or FEMA for assistance. And I didn't know that, but this is what's interesting. I don't know how many people said to me, I don't want to report damages because then the government will use my data to justify taxing us more, and we're going to end up paying for more things we don't need. Now, I'm not going to argue this point because, in all honesty, I think they're a little bit right. However, I will note that the current budgets that were set were at least a year or more ago that has allocation for FEMA at this point, and there's really nothing you can do in the moment from stopping them to spend the money to help people in natural disaster. So let's talk about that dollar threshold and why it's important. Because the reality is that if you don't hit that damages threshold of people calling as a county or a region and saying, hey, this is what was damaged, this is my estimated damage of what was done to my home or my business. If you as in a region don't hit that dollar threshold, your governor cannot ask for help, which means that the people who need the most support do not have access to a whole lot. And as a state, each state is individual. They have their own programs. I would argue that most states don't really plan for this kind of thing very well in terms of helping the individuals in their area. And it really actually comes more down to a county response than it does a state in a lot of ways. And who you vote for county commissioner, by the way, really does matter. I'm just going to say that right now. And this is where really those things come into play, is who is in charge and how are they advocating for your area. And that's unfortunate that it comes down to politics, but really that's what it is when it comes to asking for federal money or state money, etc. So that dollar threshold, essentially what that means is you cannot get any FEMA support until your region people are calling in and saying, I'm reporting damage. This is what happened to my property. And what ends up happening with that is that the federal government is not going to step in until there is that dollar threshold that is met. And that has to escalate to the governor, and then the governor asks for support from the federal government. And that's why it takes so long for there to be support in a region provided. And I think that a lot of people say, well, why didn't someone step in and help right away? Well, part of it is because it's kind of like an insurance claim where as a state, they have to get to a certain amount of damage before they can say, yes, now we can file a claim. And the faster a region reports, like individually, all these people say, hey, this is what happened to me personally, the faster that dollar amount gets met. Now, obviously, if it's a really big area and there is a massive amount of damage, that is pretty self-explanatory right away. You can just say, well, this entire town is underwater. That's a dollar amount of this, just in a quick estimate, and that can move forward a lot faster. But it is on the local states to make those calls and ask for federal assistance. And I don't know the ramifications of what it actually looks like to request additional support beyond, say, like the National Guard putting sandbags around the river or whatever, but there is a cost to these things. So each state essentially kind of runs a cost-benefit analysis of what it will cost them to provide support. And even if your county says, yes, we need more, even your county does that on a county level of what do we have reserved for emergencies and what can we afford to put out to help our citizens. So there's like so many layers of cost-benefit analysis that do go on. And that's why it does take a lot longer for people to come out and help, because they're all thinking, we have to pay these people. What can we afford to pay them, and what do we have to be able to send out these resources. So that's why volunteers are so important. People who are in your community, or even you yourself saying, I'm just going to help my neighbors. Because when we can come together and support one another, it's going to go a lot better than relying on the government to save you. So the next question, I know a lot of you are asking because it was a big political thing and whatever else going on at the time. What actually happened to the SBA money that was supposed to be set aside for natural disaster loans? Well, to be honest with you, I don't know the full story there. And the reason I don't is because a lot of it was very politically motivated. And if you want to get into that specifically to find out the fact checking and whatever, I think there's quite a few news sources that do a good job at looking at those things post claim of what actually happened, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not going to get into that. But what I will tell you factually is that the SBA did run out of money. And I think a big piece of that is because they had a specific budget that they were allowed to use for that. And when North Carolina got hit, that budget got depleted incredibly fast. And in my experiences, one of the things that I was told from a FEMA relief worker for my business, I said, well, I don't really want to take on more debt or look at that as a model for my business right now, even though I did suffer damages. And what I was told multiple times by different individuals was, it doesn't matter if you decide to take the money or not, but they really encouraged me to apply for a loan, even if I decided not to get the loan, because it could inhibit my ability in the future from going after any kind of grant funding that was going to come out later on. And I was like, I don't know if that's entirely accurate, but what have I got to lose from getting all my stuff in order and just seeing what's available? And so I did go through the initial stages of applying for a SBA loan just to see what the process looked like. I ended up not finishing it just because I didn't really think it was entirely necessary, except for just to get my foot in the door regarding whether or not there was going to be other things coming out later that I wanted to take advantage of, because I just don't really want more debt right now. But with that being said, the process for getting that funding is almost identical to a regular loan that you would get through the SBA. So if you've already been through that process once before, it's really not that much different. You do have to get all your paperwork in order, which honestly is kind of difficult in the midst of a crisis. So if you are feeling overwhelmed by it, I did notice that if you start the application and just send in everything that you can at the time, and then if they're asking for more information from your bank or whatever later, as long as you get that application in right away, it will keep it open for a couple months. So just keep that in mind. Even if you have to come back to it in a little bit, just submit your primary paperwork if that's something you do want to take advantage of, because that will at least start your application, and then you can go back and finish it later. So that was super interesting. But getting back to like the whole they did run out of money, I actually got a recording because they left a voicemail after I applied. And there was all this stuff in the news about, oh, well, they ran out of money, blah, blah, blah. I was like, okay, well, whatever. I'm not really focused on that. But listen to this, okay? I legitimately got multiple phone calls, and usually I answered them. So it was interesting that I got this one captured in my voicemail as a recording. And check this out.
Hello. This is a call from the U.S. Small Business Administration about your SBA disaster loan application. We noticed you have not completed your SBA disaster loan application. We wanted to notify you that due to a lapse in funding, new loan offers will be delayed until Congress provides additional funding for the disaster loan program. Although we are currently experiencing a lapse in funding, we are still accepting and reviewing disaster loan applications. Once Congress provides additional funding, the SBA will quickly resume new loan offers based on the order in which applications were received.
Okay, so that was real. That did happen. And I was like, what, really? I thought this was all just like big hype. But no, they did actually run out of money. And so one thing that I think is important about that voicemail, that's good to note, if ever this happens again with a natural disaster, which it may, if you get your application in, it's going to be processed in the first come, first serve manner. And even if they do run out of money, they're going to try to go to Congress and get approved for more. So you should still fill it out, even if you think you're not going to be able to get it right away. The next question that I know a lot of you are probably asking, because I was too, are there grants available to businesses from a natural disaster standpoint? Now, I would say at the beginning, no, for the most part. Unless maybe say like there's specific industry things, like if you're an artist, you can claim you're in the midst of an emergency or a crisis. There are some funding sources for that kind of stuff where there's like an emergency going on. But really, there's nothing for most businesses. There are a couple grants out there when it comes to nonprofits as well for emergency things like flooding, fire, whatever. But for the most part, there's really not a lot available. And I will say that is with the caveat that later on, a lot of times there is something. And additional caveat, when you do your taxes, a lot of times there's this question within there that says, did you experience a natural disaster? And so there are some like tax implications that could help you out a little bit. But when it comes to just funding to be able to get you up and going again, it doesn't come right away. And some states or regions will go after resources from the federal government, from like their current budgets or whatever, if they have like excess, surplus, stuff like that, to try to help businesses. But it's going to be almost a year, 6 months, a year, 2 years down the road. And a lot of times it's like you have to keep really good books to be able to show that you lost money, etc. So here's an example of this. The state of Minnesota did try to provide some grant relief money to businesses during the COVID-19 pandemic in the forced shutdown. But for that specific program, you had to apply, and then you had to be picked out of a lottery after proving loss of income. And with that, you also had to prove that you were in good standing with the Secretary of State for the state of Minnesota. And this is where another thing I think is really important. I saw a lot of businesses that were 20 years old, 40 years old, whatever. They'd been paying their sales tax every quarter or every month, whatever they needed to do. And they were like, yeah, I'm in good standing with the state of Minnesota. But the reality is that they actually were such an old business that they were not in the online registration for the Secretary of State because that came later. And so when they said, well, look us up, they're like, well, you're not even in our system. But they've been collecting their money for years. And so it was really hard to get all that paperwork in order really fast to say, hey, look, I have a legitimate business. I've been paying my sales tax. I've been paying my annual taxes, whatever, for the state of Minnesota, and I'm in good standing. I don't owe anything. And so if you're an older business, this is something to really think about on a state level. Go back and make sure that you are registered within their online resources, because it may be that you've been doing everything by pen and paper, keeping track of all your receipts, keeping your books really nice on paper, but they don't actually have any of your stuff digitally to look up really quickly. So that's another tip I learned during that process, to make sure everything is up to where it should be for the standards that you need, okay? The other thing is that if ever there is something federally that's going to come out as a grant, you as a business also need to be registered within the federal portal to receive funding directly from the federal government. And that's usually, it's sam.gov. And when you register for that, a lot of times there is a local person that specifically works in the Small Business Administration or with your state on helping you register in that portal and within the right industry, your NAICS codes, all that kind of stuff. And they'll walk you through that. But if it's something where funding comes out and it's a first come, first serve situation, it's really best to get all of that stuff in order and have a government login to be able to apply for those grants before they close or before they run out of money. And honestly, trying to book a meeting with someone who, say, is a professional technical assistance advisor, they call them like PTAC, or in our region now they changed their name to Apex. It's always changing the name, but there's people that will do that with you that are part of the state and or federal agency that will sit down and show you how to do that. And that's also the same process you would go through if you were going to do federal or state contracting. Now, please note, SAM.gov is for federal. And then if there is a state portal to do work for the state or get a grant through the state, it's a different portal. So you're going to have to make sure that you know which one is which. And unfortunately, and also fortunately, right, because security is important, maintaining those things you have to renew every year. And it takes probably 15 minutes to do the whole thing to make sure you're updated and you do all of that. And then a lot of times too, whenever you log in, every quarter they make you change your password. So make sure that you keep those things up to date, occasionally looking at it to ensure that you have everything in order that you need. So that's just another side tip if you are thinking, oh, wow, post-natural disaster, I want to be prepared if a year from now they come out with any kind of funding that I could look at. So those two things on a federal and a state level, very important. That's how people get paid, and a lot of times how you also apply for the funding. So just keep that in mind, that the more you have available and ready, the easier it's going to be. So the other thing I would say is that a lot of times within a region, especially where there's like significant impacts to like the biggest damage, there are other organizations like the United Way or independent nonprofits that set up like a GoFundMe for the most impacted communities to see any sort of resourcing help they can. And so it's really important to know in your region who is being helped and how they are getting helped. So paying attention to those nonprofits regionally are also going to be important tools to knowing if something is happening. And the best way to do that, I would say, is to sign up for all of their newsletters, because a lot of times they will push out that information right away to say, hey, this is what we're doing. Sign up here to give, to donate, or whatever. And then also, if you've been impacted, here's a way you can apply. So those things are really important to keep on your radar. So the next question: what should I do to prepare for a natural disaster? And that is a great question, and we are going to get into it in the next episode. So I'm going to transition to the gawk portion of this episode and tell you a quick story, and then we're going to go on to the next one. So during our flooding within our region, it was wild. There was so many people that had their basements flooding, and just honestly, it was almost sickening just to see like the height of the water and how much stuff was destroyed in people's homes, like in their basements, things just floating around, or even just going down the street and seeing, like pictures of people on kayaks next to the O'Reilly Auto Parts store that's underwater. And I just can't even imagine having to sort through all of that afterwards. On a larger scale than even what I had. It's a lot of time, it's a lot of emotional energy. And I will say that the best way I have learned now to figure out who is a really good insurance provider, if you're looking for one for your business, is to ask people who have experienced a claim what their process was like. Because sometimes insurance companies are actually subcontracting their inspections, especially within a really big area like hail damage, all that kind of stuff. You're just taking pictures of stuff and maybe it's not doing justice to the real situation because the light's hitting it wrong or whatever. And people truly aren't seeing the level of damage that you are up close and in person, or they're maybe sending out somebody who's not even a real adjuster. It's just somebody who has a license to work a drone, and they're taking pictures from the sky with this drone. And in my experience, even I was like, hey, this needs to be fixed, pointing things out. And the people that came out were not adjusters, And I had to help them even with a tape measure. Like I had to have my own tape measure and measure everything and explain how big it was and how much damage it was to make sure they got it properly in their documentation. And even within that, they missed a ton of stuff. And I had to go back and take a bunch of pictures and do a bunch more measurements and send it directly to my insurance company. So really ask people who have gone through the claim process what their experience has been like. And I would ask people who have had a claim within the last couple years, because a lot of insurance companies do change their processes, especially when there's a lot of big natural disasters happening. That's when they really start learning, oh, wow, here's where we have a bottleneck. So we should maybe subcontract this service, or we should bring this in-house, or whatever. And so things do change for insurance companies because they're trying to figure out the best way to do stuff to be fast in addressing lots of things. So just keep that in mind, that the more recent claim a person has with a company, the more real firsthand experience you're going to get regarding what that looks like. So that's the gawk for today, all about insurance companies. And if you enjoyed this episode, you should give it a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you're listening. And I will see you in part 3 of this series.